since this is the last session we have today, it's getting late in the day and people are getting tired and a little sleepy. It brings to mind a suggestion I heard on a lecture that I downloaded and was listening in the car a couple of weeks ago. And the speaker, of course, was standing at a podium and the audience was sitting down. And he said in a more civilized time, the speaker would be sitting, as I'm going to do, and the audience would be standing. So let me invite you to stand while I talk and stay awake. Oh gosh, I'm going to try to make this coherent, obvious with the rest what we've heard already today. Obviously, my paper is somewhat David tied at the hip with Jeff Young's, since we're both writing about Malthus and have some common concerns about modern day Malthusianism or neo-Malthusianism. But I think my paper may also be joined at the hip with Ollie's. And I've never thought that I would write a paper that would be any way connected with Ollie's work. I'm not a mathematician, I'm not a theorist, but there is a common bond between Ollie and myself. Like Ollie, I don't speak French. Secondly, like Ali, American Standard English is my second language. I grew up in South Carolina. Let me first say, make a comment, perhaps for the benefit or risk of graduate students who are with us. My wife and I met in graduate school, but way back, a long time ago, in the early 1970s. And there was one faculty member at the University of Virginia at the time who all the students were deathly afraid of, because we'd seen him rip into visiting economists. He wasn't mean, he just wanted to get things right. And he would be in a seminar, and he'd have his head down, and that hand would go up. And just like, oh. Was Ben McCallum. Some of you no doubt know. Ben was at UVA when we were there. And we were just deathly afraid. In fact, I wrote my thesis on monetary economics, and Ben, I knew he was going to be there, and I was deathly afraid he was going to be there at my defense. But my defense was in a room that we didn't normally use, and he got lost. And so I owe my presence here and my job at Wake Forest to Ben McCallum's inability to find the room in Old Cabell Hall in Charlottesville. But the story is when my wife was starting her thesis, she was talking with her supervisor, Ed Olson, and with Ben, and she was she hadn't started. She really hadn't done any work. She just had an idea that she'd gotten from Ed Olson on estimating hedonic values of public housing. And, like those of you who are graduate students, she's thinking, what do I know? What am I going to do? And Ben McCallum's advice was, don't worry about what you know. Just start writing. When you start writing, you'll figure out what you know and what you don't know. And we thought, well, that's easy for you to say. But it's true. So I'm somewhat in that place today because I'm writing about something that I don't know much about. Malthus, 19th century economics. I've spent over 25 years writing mostly about Milton Friedman, Chicago School, but about 20th century economics. And the only piece I can think of that I've written that wasn't about 20th century economics was a commentary on work by David and Sandy and on the abolitionists and the economist. And so I'm starting this project, and who knows whether, you may tell me, just keep your day job, stay in the 20th century. Don't try to go back to the 19th century, but really I'm just starting. And So I just started writing. Now, how do I write? I write, the way I started this project was naively, by reading Malthus. So another connection with Ali. Ali says we have to read Derrida to understand Condillac. My argument is that we have to read Malthus to understand Malthus. And that seriously is part of my argument. But I started just by I started actually with the same literature that Jeff was talking about. I teach natural resource econ. I have for a number of years, and read about the population problem over population, which of course now has been flipped on its head, and people are worrying about underpopulation. So Lauren can continue to live and have a little bit of income, and myself included. But so I went from there, learning about Malthus through the Malthusians, about what Malthus's ideas were through the Malthusians, and then I learned about the real Malthus from Ross Emmett and from reading an earlier version of Jeff's paper. So my knowledge of the secondary literature on classical economics was pretty darn thin when I started this project, and I went to the first edition and read the first edition of Malthus, or people in the know call it the first essay. And I started with Malthus. And Anthony Waterman got wind that I was writing on Malthus from Ross Emmett. He got the news, and Anthony sent me a long email and said, "Oh, I'm delighted that you're working on Malthus. I presume that you've read my work and this, now you've read this, and you've read this, and you've read this, and you've read this." No, I've read Malthus. So what do I say to Anthony? I haven't read your book that I cite in my paper, that Jeff cited, Religion, Revolution, and what's the title? Anthony's book, Religion, Revolution, and something. Yeah, Christian Political Economy. I think that's it. So I actually, when I thought about, well, what am I going to say to Anthony Waterman? He said, be careful that you don't reinvent the wheel. You know, you don't want to come up with some idea that those of us in the know about Malthus is old hat to us. And of course, once I start reading the secondary literature, reading Anthony, reading Donald Winch, reading others, I realized that, in discovering what Malthus was saying in the essay by reading Malthus, I'm not coming up with something that other people haven't thought of. But my explanation to Anthony, and this again is an idea for graduate students to ponder, my explanation to Anthony is that I actually have found that the way I work is by starting off by reading the primary source without the filter of the secondary literature. And I did that with Milton Friedman. I just happened because I wasn't trained in history of economic thought. I took one course in graduate school. So that is my way of working when I start something new, to read the primary literature, see what I think the author is saying, and then go to the secondary literature. So the bottom line here is that, and it may or may not be the case for my paper here, but often naivety can be very productive. And that's why I like teaching introductory econ, because the introductory econ students haven't yet learned what they're supposed to know. And they're not afraid of asking dumb questions. So that's just by way of kind of letting you know kind of where I'm coming from. And I'm working totally with the first edition of Malthus's essay. So I began with the idea that most people misunderstand Malthus, probably because they haven't read Malthus, because they've learned about Malthus's idea, maybe from Garrett Hardin, maybe from somebody else. Jeff gave us a number of quotations here. And I was convinced by Ross Emmett and by Jeff, and then by teaching the essay in my course, that Malthus was not a Malthusian. So my question, my historical question, is how did Robert Bob become Thomas? How did Malthus become this statue? How did the rose, another tie at the hip, how did the rose become the statue? Okay, so that's the question that prompted me to read Malthus here and write this paper. Now, just briefly, I realize I'm probably not the only person here who didn't read all the papers before they arrived. So I'll just give you the sections of my paper. I'm going to read a bit of the some of the conclusion toward the end of the time, but just to give you the sections of the paper. There's an introduction which says sort of what I've been saying here, except for about Ben McCallum. He's not in the paper. Second section, what did Malthus mean? And then in the heading, I answer the question. It's almost all in Godwin and Condorcet. The third section is Malthus was not Charles Darwin. Fourth section, applying the principle of population, as we find it in Malthus's essay, to sketches of the perfectibility of man and society. The fifth section is, but Malthus's essay was also, to a lesser extent, about the poor law. And the sixth section is from Malthus to Malthusianism. Godwin, Boulding, and Waterman read the essay. So this is looking at how William Godwin, Kenneth Boulding, and Waterman, Anthony Waterman, read the essay. Now, let me give you a few examples that go along with the Malthusian interpretations that Jeff had up in his slides. I was in London last month for the Eshet meetings, and while there I visited the Museum of Natural History, and they have an exhibit called the Museum Treasures. So this is interpretations of Malthus. Museum Treasures. And among the treasures is a display of Alfred Russel Wallace's insect collection. Of course, Wallace was the co-discoverer of the theory of natural selection with Darwin. And here's what the little sign at the display said. Alfred Russel Wallace set off in 1854 for the Malay archipelago on an 8-year trip. Bedbound by a bout of fever in 1858, Wallace thought about Thomas Malthus's theory that human population growth will tend to outstrip the food supply, leading to fierce competition for food resources. Only the best competitors would survive. Wondering if this could also be applied to animals, the theory of evolution by natural selection came to him in a flash. Thrilled by this revelation, Wallace wrote to someone he knew would be interested, Charles Darwin. So I think now we have 3 co-founders, co-discoverers of the theory of natural selection: Charles Darwin, Wallace, and Malthus. There, in that exhibit, there was actually on the museum website, I found in the Wallace collection an article from the March 1909 Pall Mall magazine, Dr. Alfred Russel Wallace at Home, and this was an article based on an interview with Wallace. 150 years ago, there lay in the island of Ternate in the Malay archipelago a young naturalist stricken with fever. His enthusiasm for collecting had received a sudden check. That wasn't a population check, though it may have been. And his work was brought absolutely to a standstill. He could do nothing out of doors, and inside the native house where he had made his home, he could only lie and ponder over the problems which study and research had suggested to his fertile brain. One of the problems was that of the origin of species, which had engaged the attention of the greatest naturalist in all countries from times immemorial. The patient had convinced himself that one species changed into another, but the question was how. As he lay there in Ternate, he called to mind Malthus's exposition of the checks to increase afforded by war, pestilence, and famine, and then it suddenly flashed across his mind that this self-acting process would improve the race, that the weakest would go to the wall and the fittest would survive. It was like a streak of illuminating lightning on the dark sky of ignorance and conjecture, the explanation of many problems for the solution of which many scientific men have been groping for centuries. At the, another example, at the Eschat meetings, we were greeted by Julius Weinberg, who's Vice Chancellor of Kingston University, where we were meeting. And Mr. Weinberg is a medical doctor, and he told us that he knew very little of economics, but speaking to a group of historians of economics, he tried to connect with us just as Lauren has by using economic terminology and showing that he's at least familiar with the literature. But I think Lauren knows a lot more about economics than Dr. Weinberg. And he's a real doctor, not a doctor of philosophy. Nonetheless, you know more economics than he did. And he told us, among his comments were Malthus, who's responsible for economics being referred to as the dismal science, because Malthus predicted a nutritional catastrophe. And Malthus's nutritional catastrophe contrasted with the gay science of Thomas Carlyle. So undoubtedly, Mr. Weinberg has never attended the Summer Institute, nor has he read David Levy, How the Dismal Science Got Its Name. Then my last example here before I get into Malthus and Condorcet and Godwin is I co-taught natural resource economics with a colleague this semester for the first time I've ever done that. It was a lot of fun. But my co-teacher, some of you probably know through EHNet, Robert Waples, who's the editor of EHNet book reviews. Well, I don't think Robert will mind me telling this story because we've laughed about it. But I finished, we saved our discussion of the population problem to the end of the semester. And I just finished this draft of this paper, and I gave it to Robert, and I said, take a look at this. And I've been talking with him all along, telling him what I was doing, and the argument I'm making is Malthus wasn't a Malthusian. He simply, that's not what he was writing about. He was criticizing utopian communism. He wasn't predicting anything about overpopulation of the world. And I gave Robert my paper and said, take a look at it, see if you think it would be good to have our students read this paper. But, you know, it might be more history of economic thought than we want to impose on our students. And the next day he said, yeah, I think you're right. I think it's more history of economic thought than we want to impose on our students. And I have a little model that I use in my intro to econ class, and I'd like to start off with that, he said. So I'd like to start off with my model, and then you can talk about the real Malthus without having them read your paper. So he came in with his model, which you've seen already. It's the ecological model. And Robert referred to this as a crude Malthusian model. Okay? So crude meaning this is not the real Malthus. This is very stylized Malthus. Start with the Cobb-Douglas production function. I think that Cobb and Douglas were a couple years after Malthus. Okay? There wasn't no such thing. A subsistence wage, where subsistence is real subsistence. Just enough to live and produce the food that keeps you alive, to work and produce the food that keeps you alive. Got a subsistence wage. He told the students, this model is equally applicable to human beings and to antelopes. Any species. It's the ecological, the biological model. And then he went through the model and essentially didn't use the terms, but came up with the dismal theorem and the utterly dismal theorem, where the only difference is how many people are miserable. You have fewer people miserable or a lot more people. miserable. And as it was very interesting, because as he went through the model, he switched back and forth between referring to this as the crude Malthusian model and referring to Malthus. So you see, he's attributing the model to the man without even realizing it. Okay. So then we gave an essay, it gave an essay exam, and they had students had a choice of essays, and there was one essay that they could choose that was on the population issue, and I was going to grade that. They should have known I would grade that. I would think they would. Pardon?
Did you tell them?
Didn't tell them who was going to grade it. I didn't tell them who was going to grade it. That's we should have done that. That would have been, if I'd anticipated, we would have done that. We had 25 students, and I think about 17 of them wrote the population essay. And of the 17, probably 3/4 of them, if they referred to Malthus, and hopefully they would refer to Malthus or Malthusians, but probably 3/4 of them referred to Malthus in the context of Wapel's model, of the ecological model. That is, what I said somehow went over their heads or through their heads. It didn't connect, but they could get the model. These are econ majors. They could get the model, which gets me to my thesis that I've just started, really, I think, to develop here. And my project, if I continue with it, is try to understand the evolution of people's conception of what Malthus was writing about from what he was really writing about initially in 1798. Of course, it went through all the editions, so what he was writing about changed. But then you go through the 19th century, you got Wallace, you got Darwin, you got all the evolution business, then you get to eugenics, then you get to the end of the world because we're using up all the resources. So there's this long evolution of different forms of different understandings of what Malthus was writing about, what his essay was about. And in working on Milton Friedman, and now I guess in working on Malthus, my sort of North Star is context. Context, context, context. What was Malthus's context? So that's what I'm trying to do here in this paper, is cover the context from which Malthus wrote. Okay, we can see that, and it's not hard to find that. It's hard to avoid it. That's one of the interesting things about this this experience, kind of the history of interpretation of Malthus. It's not hard at all to find out what Malthus is writing about, unlike perhaps Mr. Derrida. It's a little more difficult. So, Mitch, it's going to all be clear. It's all read Malthus and it's all clear. To go back to, Ali was picking on you. Nobody's picked on you this afternoon, but you were picking on him. And I'm just glad you're not yet picking on me, David. Okay. We can see the context in the full title of the essay. An essay on the principle of population as it affects the future improvement of society, with remarks on the speculations, and that's an important word, speculations, of Mr. Godwin, Monsieur Condorcet, and other writers. And then I have a quotation. I'm going to be reading some quotations from Malthus and Godwin and Condorcet that are in my paper. Malthus wrote, and my references here is maybe kind of awkward, but I'm using the Liberty Fund edition of Malthus, which doesn't have pagination, so I think I've numbered them myself. So this is early in the essay, page 7. This is Malthus. It has been said that the great question is now at issue whether man shall henceforth start forwards with accelerating velocity toward illimitable and hitherto unconceived improvement, or be condemned to a perpetual oscillation between happiness and misery, and after every effort remain still at an immeasurable distance from the wished-for goal. I have read some of the speculations on the perfectibility of man and of society with great pleasure. I've been warmed and delighted by the enchanting picture which they hold forth. I ardently wish for such happy improvements, but I see great and, to my understanding, unconquerable difficulties in the way to them. So Malthus depicted himself as a follower of Adam Smith, as a sort of empirical, historical economist, and he criticized speculative philosophy that is not based in any way on real-world observation. He makes fun of the speculative philosophers and of this would-be Condorcet and Godwin when he writes, after paying respect to their candor and ability, oh, this is me. Oh my God. This is Hammond quoting Hammond. Oh. There's not a first footnote, but there's a footnote to the footnote, but I eliminated the first footnote. Yeah. So Malthus, okay, let me just read this so I don't get any more confused. After paying respect to their candor and ability, Malthus poses the hypothetical case of a speculative philosopher suggesting that man will in the future become an ostrich. Absent evidence of men with elongated necks, lips turned into beaks, and hair turning into feathers, notwithstanding that he cannot prove the prediction in error, it cannot be considered likely that man will become an ostrich. Hence, it is not reasonable to spend time and effort speculating on how happy life would be in a society of ostriches, and this is quoting Malthus, where all narrow luxuries would be condemned, where he, man become an ostrich, would be employed in collecting only the necessaries of life, and where consequently each man's share of labor would be light and his portion of leisure ample. This was directed actually at Godwin rather than Condorcet. One more passage from Malthus, not from Hammond, from Malthus before I get into Condorcet and then Godwin. Malthus wrote, "The natural inequality of the two powers of population and the production of the earth, and that great law of our nature which must constantly keep their effects equal, form the great difficulty that appears to me insurmountable in the way to the perfectibility of society. All other arguments are of slight and subordinate consideration in comparison of this. I see no way by which man can escape from the weight of this law which pervades all animated nature. No fancied equality, no agrarian regulations in their utmost extent could remove the pressure of it even for a single century, and appears therefore to be decisive against the possible existence of a society, all the members of which should live in ease, happiness, and comparative leisure, and feel no anxiety about providing the means of subsistence for themselves and their families. Consequently, if the his premises are just, the argument is conclusive against the perfectibility of the mass of mankind." So what he's referring to here is the population principle, which is an equilibrium system. Population is always in equilibrium, just as an economist would see demand and supply as always in or tending toward a market tending toward or in equilibrium, and the work is to figure out how that equilibrium is determined. What are the forces that impinge on the equilibrium population? So there's not a forecast of some equilibrium out there that we're going to get to, the ecological sort of equilibrium, subsistence equilibrium of utter misery that we're going to get to. Population, he's an equilibrium demographer. Population is always in equilibrium. And the purpose of the population principle is to argue against this utopian communism. Tied at the hip to David, perhaps Godwin was a laissez-faire fundamentalist because he wanted to do away with all institutions and let the flowers bloom. Godwin was a 1960s child. I won't mention drugs and sex, Bob. Okay. So, to get... So I'm gonna go to Condorcet and I'm gonna Godwin, but go back to what I, by writing, figured out was my thesis, and I didn't know my thesis really when I started writing, is that the model, which you saw on the board, in the slides, the model is irresistible for economists, and the model is irresistible for ecologists. The model is what people see. Just as my students caught the model, they didn't catch what I was saying about what Malthus was actually writing about. So, Condorcet, let me share a few passages from Condorcet with you. Here on the prospects of human perfection and societal perfection. Condorcet writes, "We shall find the strongest reasons to believe from past experience, from observations of the progress which the sciences and civilization have hitherto made, and from the analysis of the march of the human understanding and the development of its faculties, that nature has fixed no limits on our hopes." Nature has fixed no limits on our hope. There's no underlying natural constraint on our perfectibility of ourselves as individuals and of society. Then will arrive the moment in which the sun will observe in its course free nations only, acknowledging no other master than their reason. Of course, this is the Enlightenment, in which tyrants and slaves, priests and their stupid and hypocritical instruments will no longer exist, but in history and upon the stage, in which our only concern will be to lament their past victims and dupes, and by the recollection of their horrid enormities to exercise a vigilant circumspection, that we be able constantly to recognize and effectually to stifle by the force of reason, not by the guillotine, but by the force of reason, the seeds of superstition and tyranny, should they ever presume again to make their appearance upon the earth. By the way, when Condorcet was in jail, he didn't give up the faith. When he was awaiting execution, he did not give up the faith. The advantages that must result from the state of improvement of which I have proved we may almost entertain with certain hope can have no limit but the absolute perfection of the human species. And then one more. It may, however, be demanded whether amidst the improvement in industry and happiness, where the wants and faculties of men will continually become better proportioned, each successive generation possess more various stores, and of consequence in each generation the number of individuals be greatly increased, there's population. It may, I say, be demanded whether these principles of improvement and increase may not, by their continual operation, ultimately lead to degeneracy and destruction, whether the number of inhabitants in the universe at length exceeding the means of existence, there will not result a continual decay of happiness and population, and a progress toward barbarism, or at least a sort of oscillation between good and evil. Okay, and then one more from Condorcet. Men will then know that the duties they may be under relative to propagation of the species will consist not in the question of giving existence to a greater number of beings, but happiness, will have for their object the general welfare of the human species, of the society in which they live, of the family to which they are attached, and not the puerile idea of encumbering the earth with useless and wretched mortals. So there's a bit of Condorcet, which is the context from which Malthus was writing. And of course, his father, Daniel Godwin, had been influenced by these ideas. So the essay started as from a discussion with his father. Now, William Godwin, who was an English fan of the ideas behind the French Revolution. Godwin thought that institutions, human institutions such as property and such as marriage, led to vice, and then the vice led to misery. So human nature is good, and it's corrupted by these human institutions, including the pursuit of wealth, and human behavior, including the institutions lead to vice, which includes the pursuit of wealth. If superfluity were banished, the necessity for the greater part of the manual industry of mankind would be superseded, and the rest, being amicably shared among all the active and vigorous members of the community, would be burdensome to none. Every man would have a frugal yet wholesome diet. Every man would go forth to that moderate exercise of his corporal functions that would give hilarity to the spirits. None would be made torpid with fatigue, and all would have the leisure to let loose his faculties in search of intellectual improvement. Referring to the system of property. Thus, the established system of property may be considered as strangling a considerable portion of our children in their cradle. Again, it's property institutions that are keeping population down. Whatever population of people who are going to have plenty. Whatever may be the value of the life of a man, or rather whatever would be his capability of happiness in a free and equal state of society, the system we are here opposing may be considered as a resting upon the threshold of existence, 4/5 of that value and that happiness. This is me. In the community envisioned by Godwin, there's no market exchange, no markets. And among the institutions that he foresees disappearing are markets. There's no need for markets, for each man knows his true needs and recognizes that the needs of every other person have equal merit with his needs or her needs. So quoting Godwin, here the first and simplest motive to personal accumulation is instantly cut off. I need not accumulate to protect myself against accidents, sickness, or infirmity, for these are claims the validity of which is not regarded as the subject of doubt, and with which every man is accustomed to comply. I can accumulate in a considerable degree nothing but what is perishable. For exchange being unknown, that which I cannot personally consume adds nothing to the sum of my wealth. And this equality in the absence of institutions extended beyond the markets to family life, personal life. All attachments to individuals, except in proportion to their merits, are plainly unjust. It is therefore desirable that we should be the friends of man rather than of particular men, and that we should pursue the chain of our own reflections with no other interruption than information or philanthropy requires. It is absurd to expect that the inclinations and wishes of two human beings should coincide through any long period of time. To oblige them to act and live together is to subject him to some inevitable portion of thwarting, bickering, and unhappiness. Marriage. The supposition that I must have a companion for life is the result of a complication of vices. It is the dictate of cowardice and not of fortitude. It flows from the desire of being loved and esteem for something that is not desert. I mean, he was not any soft-hearted sentimentalist. If you don't deserve to live, he and Godwin actually leads to Garrett Hardin more than Malthus does, I think.
Who was that quote from?
This is Godwin, William Godwin. This is William Godwin. Yeah, this is William Godwin on marriage.
Again, I have to ask you, who is Mary Wallace de Craft? Is that his wife or his son? Well, I think that's relevant. It's his wife.
Wife, yeah, wife, yeah.
We don't always live up to our expectations.
Right. We have our ideals, and then there's so long, this is Godwin again, so long as I seek to engross one woman to myself and to prohibit my neighbor from proving his superior desert and reaping the fruits of it, I am guilty of the most odious of all monopolies. He was an original antitruster. As long as this state of society continues, philanthropy will be crossed and checked in 1,000 ways, and the still augmenting stream of abuse will continue to flow. It's not clear at all to me what he means when he uses the term philanthropy. It's not love of neighbor. I ought to prefer no human being to another because that human being is my father, Father's Day, my wife, or my son, but because for reasons which equally appeal to all understandings, that being is entitled to preference. One among the measures which will successively be dictated by the spirit of democracy, and that probably at no great distance, is the abolition of surnames. There'll be no need to know who your father is, who your mother is, who your children are, because in Woodstock, everybody is going to take care of everybody else, because they will reasonably be eminently reasonable people who understand their duties from justice to other people. One more quotation from Godwin, and I'm going on and on because I think this is really important. This is what Malthus was writing about. This is very important. The men, this is Godwin, the men who, therefore, who exist when the earth shall refuse itself to a more extended population will cease to propagate. So now he's anticipating that there could be population problems here in this sort of society where people just you don't make love, you make justice with men and women, make justice, and babies come about. The men, therefore, who exist when the earth shall refuse itself to a more extended population, the limits of growth, will cease to propagate, for they will no longer have any motive, either of error or duty, to induce them. In addition to this, they will perhaps be immortal. The whole will be a people of men and not of children. Generation will not succeed generation, nor truth have in a certain degree to recommence herself. Nor will truth have in a certain degree to recommence her career at the end of every 30 years. There will be no loss of human capital because it'll be permanent. The possessors of human capital will be immortal. There will be no war, no crimes, no administration of justice, as it is called, and no government. These latter articles are at no great distance, and it is not impossible that some of the present race of men may live to see them in part accomplished. But besides this, there will be no disease, no anguish, no melancholy, and no resentment. Every man will seek with ineffable ardor the good of all. Mind will be active and eager, yet never disappointed. Men will see the progressive advancement of virtue and good and feel that, if things occasionally happen contrary to their hopes, the miscarriage itself was a necessary part of that progress. He speculated that the sexual urge would would naturally disappear and be replaced by the intellectual urge. So men and women will cease to have sexual intercourse and have babies because they will only want to attend the summer institute. You know, and after dinner, everybody says, Sandy, could we go back and talk some more? The vans going to Richmond tomorrow night would be empty. Everybody would be here talking about ideas. So he really believed this, or at least he wrote it. Now I look around my college campus at young men and young women at the beginning of a weekend on Thursday night. And I think he was right. They're usually off in a corner somewhere talking about Aristotle or diminishing marginal utility or something. Not drinking beer and doing things they shouldn't do. Okay. So once again, my thesis is that how did an essay that was written as a counter-argument to the kind of argument I've been quoting from, how did that become what Jeffrey has presented to us as, you know, these models? How did it become Malthusianism? Okay, so, and my thesis is the model is irresistible. How are we doing on time, Sandy? 5, okay. I'll just say that I think it starts with William Godwin's 1801 response to Dr. Parr's Spittle sermon, Mr. McIntosh, and the author of an essay on population. So the first essay was published anonymously. So when Godwin wrote his 1801 response to Malthus, he didn't know or wasn't supposed to know who Malthus was. I wondered, would he have known, do you think? Okay, so he knew who it was. He just kind of kept with the fiction. Okay, so Godwin starts off by saying, oh, this is a wonderful work, and I'm so honored that he's in this work. He's considered my work. But then he basically turns that right around and is the first to characterize Malthus as a misanthrope, that what Malthus wants is more misery. The more misery, the better. That's the way he reads Malthus's essay in his response. Kenneth Boulding, Jeff mentioned Kenneth Boulding's foreword to the University of Michigan Press issue of the essay. And that's interesting because Boulding begins the foreword by noting the irony that a, quote, kindly, gentle, sensitive, sincere Christian minister stands for a cruel, mechanical doctrine of despair. But then Boulding goes on to interpret Malthus in a 1960s fashion as someone who was predicting overpopulation of the earth, sort of Malthus anticipating Paul Ehrlich and the population bomb. The more interesting, perhaps, example that I have is Anthony Waterman, who, as Jeff says, knows probably as much or more about Malthus as anybody, except perhaps Donald Winch. So what about Anthony's treatment of Malthus? In his book, Revolution, Economics, and Religion, and that's the book I couldn't remember the title of, it's 261 pages in which Anthony develops the intellectual, the religious, and the political context from which Malthus wrote in the late 18th century Britain. Biographical details of his life, and to commentaries on the essay from its anonymous publication, at 1798, through the subsequent editions. Okay? So Anthony gets all the context right. But then what does Anthony do? In part, Anthony's way of doing history of economics is rational reconstruction, mathematical reconstruction. So what he does is reconstructs Malthus, as you have seen from Jeff. So my interpretation of this, and of course Anthony was writing for Economists, so my interpretation, my criticism of Anthony at the end of the day, is after all this effort in the book to get the history right, to get the context right, in effect, he throws it away with his appendices, because Anthony's models are in an into appendices. They're not even in the text of the book. So that's where I am in my attempt to understand, not only understand Malthus and understand how people have come to understand Malthus. And thank you for your attention.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dan, for this talk. Listening to you, I kept thinking, oh, this is how I should have talked. But I would like to put something on the table to both you and Jeff. And as you talk, I thought of it when Jeff spoke, but as you talk, it became stronger. Keynes has an important essay on Malthus. And when I last read it, I was impressed at how it was almost in Carlyle's sense on heroes and hero worship. And then going back to David's comment again, Keynes uses it in his policy prescriptions when he is in India, and working in the Indian treasury. And Keynes opposes the colonial Indian government's efforts to respond to the plague, and characterizes the plague as a beneficent divine visitation. And all of the policy of the economic policy of the Indian authorities would be frustrated by these efforts. Remember, Keynes was a eugenist
Uh-huh.
at that time. So
Yeah.
there was all of this going into the policy side. So as you both spoke, I kept wanting to go back to Keynes's essay. And now there are at least two books on this, if you like, the tawdry aspect of Keynes.
Yeah. Yeah.
And criticizing mortgages, again talking of elimination of pages,
Yeah.
elimination of these letters
Yeah.
from Keynes's collected works. And it comes into also his essay on the grandchildren, which we talked about. So let me just conclude by saying this whole idea, if I may say so, of rational reconstruction of Anthony Waterman is pregnant with meaning, because Samuelson then takes up Anthony Waterman, and Salim Rashid takes up Anthony Waterman. So it's fascinating.
Could I respond to that, Sandy? In my mind, from my corner, the real work of an intellectual historian is to get ourselves as much as we can out of our context and into the context of the author. And it's difficult to do because we're living in a culture, and we've got to get out of that culture in our minds and get back. I would say about Keynes, that's very interesting. I would say about Keynes, a lot of water had gone under the bridge between Malthus and Keynes, including Darwin and all the eugenics movement. Yeah. So my hunch, before I even started this work, my hunch was a lot of what people think of as Malthus is more Darwin than Malthus. Or it owes more to Darwin than it does to Malthus.
I enjoyed the talk. I think, the issue of models, this is what I got out of it, that economists sort of focus on models. And I think that is a general rule of what happens. The philosophers have been taking it, so they, would have translated it into the books in a quite different way. Would have had different issues, but would have had quite, different. And that is something particular about the teaching of
come up with anything new. That a whole bunch of people had it beforehand. One of them was Benjamin Franklin. One of the most important ones was a now completely forgotten, obscure Scottish economist named James Anderson. And Anderson, in particular, had it the right way in terms of that the law of growth of populations is exponential for everybody, and that then in fact he even had diminishing returns. He used the head of Ricardo and Malthus on this. He really had the whole story. So one criticism is, of course, those days they didn't care about this. Nobody cited anybody else. So to some degree, Malthus could be thought of as being sort of a codifier of stuff that was out there. They didn't cite these guys. But one argument would be that I think that in fact what made Malthus altered his story between the second and the third edition to make it sort of more sound was that he actually read Anderson, so that he may have in fact just have independently come up with his own argument without reading these guys, and then after he was at it for a while, somebody said, "Hey, look at Anderson."
You saying he did read Anderson, or he might have?
I'm not sure. This is what I want to know. I don't know. I'm wondering if Waterman or some of these other people or anybody here would know what happened. But that would seem to make sense. I mean, Anderson was much better known in those days, and in some sense he improved. If you want, you could say he improved his argument by going in the Anderson direction. But I'm just kind of wondering if anybody knows what this is. Maybe a really anal, just your thought question. I can be pretty anal sometimes.
Anyone got an answer to that?
Well, it strikes me that, in reading Malthus, that we presume that everything we want to know is measurable. And one of the big questions in Malthus's time was, what is the population of the United Kingdom? What was the population of the Roman Empire? Are there more people now than there was? So a lot of the practical demography is simply, how many people are there?
I was impressed by the paper, but I was also disappointed by it and by this sort of hermeneutics that it embodied, because it seems in this context that if you can place it in a context with a particular target, then you want to resist these sort of more universal model that may be attributed to the man. I don't have stake so much in doing this with regard to Malthus, but with regard to other figures, I think this would give you a terrible result. So, for example, John Locke, in his two treatises, he has an awful lot to say about Robert Filmer, and one could, with philosophical rectitude, historical rectitude, say all this stuff about this theory of rights and property and accumulation and so on, you're just getting it wrong. This is a response to a dead mediocrity and Filmer, or where he goes on and talks about the judicious hooker and such. The fact that these guys pick on some particular, mediocrity doesn't indicate either that one, they're not, the real target isn't somebody else, like maybe Hobbes in the case of Locke, or that this is a pretext to actually philosophize. Now maybe Malthus isn't up to doing more than knocking down some middleweight utopian, very limited interest, but I think it would be unfortunate to, at least not give him his reins and see if you can fly with something like a more generalizable picture. I'll close by saying that probably the greatest of all philosophers, Plato, is always presenting arguments against people who maybe are either unknown or certainly not giant status. And yet, I think it would be ridiculous to suppose that he really was just engaging in these not even contemporary, 40 years ago, disputes. So why should we imprison Malthus behind the age of, his contemporary targets?
Very good question. The generalization that I see in Malthus is that social institutions, like markets, property rights, are vital to prosperity, to the good life in some material sense, and that if you tear those institutions down, they will reappear. And I didn't mention that, but that's his forecast. That's his conditional forecast. You tear these institutions down, and you're not going to have a happy community, and you will rediscover the very institutions that you thought were the source of vice and misery, and find that in fact they protect you from vice and misery. Not that every institution works properly. But you sound a little, you started to almost sound a little like my wife Claire, who was an economist. She's not a philosopher, but when I told her what I was going to spend my time on, she said, who cares if the idea is Malthus's idea? Why do the labels matter? And my thought was, well, you're an economist. You probably think it doesn't matter. But I know the people at the Summer Institute will understand why you simply want to get the history right. But now I've got a philosopher, and you're just like the economist.
No, she should have been a philosopher.
Thank you, Dan. I have a question for which I'm very much interested of answer, philosophical angles, so maybe Lauren can contribute as well. And I hope it's not too much out of context to today's flow. So the question is, if God does exist, will he be classified as a good or bad economist?
God? Would he be classified as a good or bad economist?
You mean God or Godwin?
Lauren, you're the philosopher. Well, that takes us to natural law, which may be what this very broad utilitarianism is that Lauren was talking about this morning, is a catch-all for what sort of remains after natural law is dispensed with. So if you believe in natural law, either in Christian natural law or more Greek natural law, you believe that God was a good economist because God knows what it takes for humans to flourish. So I guess the answer, if God exists, yes, God would be a good economist.
And if he doesn't,
A question about James Anderson's influence. There's an article by Renee Prendergast in the Scottish Journal of Political Economy. James Anderson's political economy has influence on Smith and Malthus, and she claims that in fact Malthus read and used Anderson's theories of rent and so on. So
self-correction. So I love the birth of economic controversy in my own mind, begins a large part in the debates between Malthus and Say over the nature of which markets operate in the existence of a general glut, whether or not you can. And if you follow those letters and you read that exchange, it's all about the mechanism. It's not about it's about how prices actually work, how competition comes in, all these things like that. And there's a debate, very strong debate about the robustness, right, or the veracity of market forces to self-correct versus not, and all like that. And I'm wondering how much of that kind of discussion about mechanism is also connected up with this issue about self-correction and mechanisms here, and whether or not that's sort of, there's any kind of connection between those two, or if that's just a totally waste of time. And the other issue is thinking about I will say, by the way, just a Lauren's comment, at the time that Godwin existed, Godwin was a big deal,
Yeah.
right? So,
Oh, I know that.
yeah, so I know that you know that, but so when he's writing, he's not dealing with a middleweight, right? What he's dealing with is the guy is the heavyweight champion of the world. Just happened to be he was Buster Douglas rather than.
Pete, off the top of.
General Glut distinguished himself in the Revolution. Is that right?
Off the top of my head, I don't see the connection, but it's mainly because I don't know the macro sort of literature that well, but it's an interesting thought.
There is a really, just to follow up, I mean, I think, and many people probably have read it, but Fiona McLaughlin has a really nice piece in Hope, which is on the dialogue between Say and Malthus and the birth, she calls it the birth of economic rhetoric, and what she does is examine the way in which they do the rhetoric of that. And that's in Hope. God, that's a long time ago now, but it's a pretty interesting piece.
I think it's a much broader question here. I've concluded that people don't naturally know how to read a text. And I think if you teach the history of thought, you almost have to teach how to read a text, because it doesn't seem to come naturally, or not to everybody anyway.
And it's hard work.
Oh, it is.
It's hard work
Yeah.
when you stop, when you don't understand something, and look it up, either in the dictionary or look up a reference. Yeah.
You sound very much like Donald Boy.
He was my student.
Is it possible that Godwin is not the target after Mr. Malthus' father?
I think Daniel Malthus initially was the target. Malthus tells us that. Yeah. Yeah. But then what he essentially says, going back to Ali, is that he started writing up a response to his father, and then he went wild and ended up with 6 editions.
Dan, one person you can't blame for that coming down, or how it got to me, is Waterman. I taught that graph on the left,
Uh-huh.
I think, in the late 80s. And what I'm kind of,
It's his fault.
yeah, again, I don't know if Waterman in my class or not, I don't think so. But my question is that a lot of economic thought that comes down is very simple, convenient,
Stylized.
that
Yeah.
come out. And there's one other guy I can tell you about that one now. How much of that, I think it would be interesting if everybody would think about the people that come out, what comes down from various people.
Yeah.
It's a very convenient, nice.
And there's more and more of that when you look at a text like Marshall and compare it with the textbooks we use today. I mean, everything the students use is not right. Everything the students learn from a textbook is basically not right in some real sense.
As I listen to your discussion of Godwin and Malthus, I wonder whether any of it was informed with what went on in Jamestown as almost a pure experiment of two different models of economic exchange.
It was certainly informed by their perception of the history of the United States, of North America, both before and after Jamestown. Yeah. Now, Jamestown in particular, I've not seen any, it's a good question, but I don't know. I've not seen anything to lead me to believe. I mean, Jamestown wasn't a utopian community, was it?
In the early stages of independence, and it failed miserably, and then they moved to a more.
Did they have surnames? I'm being facetious. Did they have surnames? In what sense was Jamestown utopian?
I'm gonna let David do it.
Okay.
Possibly unrelated remark. Looking at the time.
Oh, I think this is wonderful. I mean, we gave a talk a while ago, where we mentioned that, to a very politically correct crowd, that God wanted to abolish surnames, and that got everybody really excited. But then we had to tell them the bad news that he changed his mind on the COVID issue. So this was marriage does that. Anyway, on the context, I think this is really important. And I think that this is, if you don't know the context, the models are irresistible. It's the context that falsifies. And that one of the problems, one of the claims of God, that Malthus and Jepson, and he's explicit on this, is the immortality conjecture. And God, as you know, Malthus says, God gives no evidence for it. He says it's independent of his other beliefs, and so I'm not going to worry about it. So this is just, it's not fair to take on for this because it's and the question though is, what would immortality do to God want? And maybe one thing it does is it goes after Smith's argument that our time is limited. And because our time is limited, we can't be friends with everybody. And if we can't be friends with everybody, we got to be free. And so that if you think about what's the context, where's political justice come from? In political justice, there's lumpiness about sympathy, right? In political justice, you're pushing impartiality, not sympathy. And so is this a deep response to Smith? And the immortality conjecture, if you have immortality, then all those sorts of Smith's arguments wouldn't work. You have to block those arguments. And so that is, because it's common, and even everyone that I know of reads it as Godwin Malthus. They don't read it as Smith Godwin Malthus. So in that context, that may be the larger context. You have to put a Smith in. So I think this is probably just a general equilibrium point, that what we don't read will matter.
Yeah. Thanks.
Our time is limited. Ollie?
I just wanted to say, not general equilibrium, it's a question of projection of the subspace. Which is the subspace that you project? Which is the register from which you read? And it is not only history of thought, it's all reading, and especially current economic theory reading. That's where David therefore doesn't want to venture into this thing. He says, I want to go only policy. I don't want a deep reading.
Apparently we have a disagreement in the room about whether our time is limited.